the House. Thank you, Commissioner.
Oh. Sorry for that, Madam Chair. Honourable members of this European Parliament, this chamber has already and many times debated the issue of violence and harassment against women. We have, from the Commission side, highlighted the seriousness of the problems with statistics and studies, and we know that at least 1 in every 3 women has been a victim of some sort of physical or sexual violence. But these statistics do not tell enough personal stories. And the reason we are debating this today is, of course, because of the global movement of Me Too. Real stories which has exploded in social media and other communication forums the recent weeks. Stories that have been kept locked in the memories and the hearts and minds of millions of women across the world who've been suffering, who've been silently trying to forget or cope with this or ignore the pain. Women that have been in some form or another harassed by their boss, by their colleague, by their teacher, their neighbour or a stranger in the street. These stories shout to us. It's a feminist outcry from all across the world, from women who said enough. This is enough. We refuse to be silent. We refuse to accept. This is an impressive movement. And we can only listen to those stories and try to reach from the stories to some action. We must continue to work towards eradicating this problem. Workplaces all over the world, including in the European Union and the institution, must look at how we can address this. Do we do enough? Are there enough tools to listen to those signals, to catch those stories, to act in an appropriate way? And this is work that needs to be done by men and women together. You know that since the creation of the Daphne funding programme in the 90s, the EU has supported the work of NGOs in grassroots level and national local authorities. Because this debate is, of course, much broader. We need to empower volunteers and professionals to work with victims and perpetrators when it comes to sexual violence. Local actors are best placed to tackle the problem on the ground. Without them, victims would be all alone. We have set aside €6 million last year and 12.7 for this year, and projects across the EU has been a lifeline for many organisations who would otherwise not be able to do the work. And in September, in partnership with the United Nations, the EU launched a major spotlight initiative to eliminate all kinds of violence against women and girls around the world, with an initial investment of €500 million. And thanks to the budget that you have advocated, we will come up with an EU survey on gender-based violence to be carried out by national statistic institutes and led and coordinated by Eurostat. Together, we have dedicated this year to focused actions to combat violence against women. Many things happened during this year and are still happening. The Commission, for example, launched a campaign which is engaging and supporting professionals, member states, NGOs in combating the problem. And under that campaign, we have set aside €4 million for national campaigns and selecting 10 different national projects that are now kicking off. To give an example, we are funding a campaign in association with the Italian Football League focused on passing the message to football fans that violence against women and girls is not acceptable. From a regulatory perspective, as you know, the EU accession to the Istanbul Convention against violence against women is an important step forward. This convention brings binding rules on a wide aspect of types of violence, including sexual harassment and abuse. Sexual harassment is already sanctioned in the EU legislation, but victims, as we have seen lately, do not come forward, or cases are not reported or not brought to courts. And here we must look at how we can work with national equality bodies to address this problem so that we support in time the support to these victims. The modern structures of the Istanbul Convention and our EU Victims Directive, with a strong focus on victim support and on training of police, can make a difference here. We need, of course, to watch the implementation, and that is why, under the Victims' Rights Directives, we have already launched an infringement case for non-transposition of this directive. and we continue our compliance check and look how the directive is actually applied on the ground in member states. So you are now raising today a broad problem that has got its legitimate attention, of course, through the recent Me Too movement, and here we need to go forward hand in hand. We need to work, everybody, especially men, to say no to harassment, no to violence against women. So I thank you very much for putting this on the agenda today.
Merci Madame la Commissaire. Bonjour mes chers collègues.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Commissioner. Good morning, colleagues. We're now going to start with the EPP. Mrs. KOZŁOWSKA for 2 minutes.
Dziękuję bardzo Pani Przewodnicząca.
Thank you very much, President, ladies and gentlemen, Commissioner. Harassment, sexual harassment and abuse is a form of abuse which is defined in international treaties. It is a very generally present, omnipresent situation which is very hard to really notice. It is very hard to find a woman who has not encountered it in her life. So if this phenomenon is so omnipresent and so old, we may ask the question, why are we talking about it in particular today, and why everybody is writing about it, why everybody is talking about it? No new law has been entered into effect, but the fact is that we've come to the brink of patience and the silence has been broken. Victims have started speaking up and their voice has begun to be heard. This is why all the institutions which have to look at this issue there has been a lot of light shed on them. We see how they operate, how effective they are, and what are the greatest obstacles in reporting cases of harassment. We also learned that a majority of cases described in the media have never been notified to the official authorities because of shame, because of a fear of losing a job. And if we're talking about significant institutions such as the European Parliament, we have other fears coming into play, the fear that we might be undermining the prestige of the employer. So we see a number of barriers encountered by victims. Once again, as we talk about abuse and violence, we talk about victims, but we also fail to see the external context within which it all is taking place. We talk very little about perpetrators and witnesses of abuse. Recently, the French Minister of Finance was asked in an interview whether he would tell on his colleague if he knew that he was the active side in harassment. And he said no, of course not. And this is a prevalent view and approach. People close their eyes, they don't want to see it. No doubt that I'm not satisfied that we are talking about the European Parliament and cases within the Parliament today. Here we establish legislation, we have procedures, regulations and tools to fight against this phenomenon. We need to start using them.
Colleagues, I was awaiting the end of the interpretation because you spoke exceptionally fast. I'll wait till you put your headphones on. You spoke really incredibly fast, madam. So I would ask you please to take account of the interpreters when you make your speech. Mr. Batten, I saw a blue card. Can you accept that, madam?
Elle accepte. Attendez, Monsieur Batten, d'abord.
Hang on, Mr. Batten. Hang on. Could you wait, please, for Mrs. KOZŁOWSKA to have accepted? You have the floor for 30 seconds.
Thank you. You spoke a great deal, madam, about cases not being brought to court and cases being blocked. Now, you're well aware that the press are now talking about cases of sexual harassment in this Parliament. The press have picked that up. I was made aware of this several months ago on the grapevine by a very reliable source that this was going to hit the newspapers very soon, so much so that I actually mentioned it on the Daily Politics programme some months ago, and then it didn't hit the press and nothing happened. My equally reliable source told me that the proceedings had been in some way impeded and blocked by Mr. Schulz, who had been instrumental in intervening.
Votre question, monsieur.
To your question, please.
Monsieur, votre question.
Could you come to your question, please?
Take that into account in this discussion.
Monsieur, ça n'était pas vraiment une question.
That was not really a question. I would ask you to respect your speaking time and the procedure, please. Madam, you have 30 seconds if you have a response.
Znaczy, oczywiście nie mogę się wypowiadać o...
Well, it would be difficult for me to speak on this specific case. I'm not familiar with it. I may only say that at our parliament and at all other parliaments in a majority of institutions, also private institutions, there are committees and there are procedures that might help in cases of harassment. The problem is that this is not a very visible phenomenon, and these cases are not brought to our attention because there is a social agreement to that.
Thank you very much indeed. On behalf of the Socialists and Democrats, Ms. Garcia Perez, 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you, Commissioner, for what you've said. According to the Fundamental Rights Agency, something like 45 to 55% of European women have suffered sexual harassment at some stage in their lives. I'll make a number of quotes that will be familiar to you. It was an open secret you'd like to provoke. Could you see how she was dressed? These are kind of comments that show complicity and try to justify behavioural patterns that derive from an unequal society where one side establishes a relationship of power over the other side. That's what gives rise to sexual harassment. Unfortunately, that's a reality that nowhere is immune from, including public institutions, even this Parliament. We can put a blindfold on and say, oh, it's nothing to do with us, and there's nothing we need to do about this. Or, on the contrary, we can bring this issue into the light and try and get the Bureau to adopt proper measures. Parliament has instruments today to cope with these situations, but clearly they're not working properly, which is why in our motion for resolution we call for external input to strengthen our provisions and work out how we can improve the system and make it really useful for the victims. Showing solidarity and being on their side so they don't feel ashamed, and making sure they have no reason to fear they'll lose their jobs. We have to make it clear that that the harasser is the only guilty party. We need to take the necessary steps to address these situations, because the shadow of doubt affects has to affect the perpetrators. We can't have any more attacks on women's dignity, no more complicit looks, and no looking away. 'Cause Me Too.
Thank you very much indeed. For 1 minute, Mrs. Wiśniewski on behalf of ECR.
Thank you very much, President. Ladies and gentlemen, today we are talking about something extremely important, about sexual harassment and abuse of women. We're talking about it in the context of the EU. We are saying that such things have happened or are happening in the Parliament, which is proof enough how inefficient is our institution. Here, in this very heart of European democracy, we have women being molested and harassed. This is unimaginable. Our today's debate should give strength to women so they can talk about it, so they can say no. And the strength emanating from our today's debate should have this result. Women should feel brave enough, courageous enough to say that if they are harassed, they should talk about it. So the result of this debate should not merely be an external audit of European Parliament. All of us ladies, all of us here, should also remember all those underage girls who are forced to marry older men. We have to remember them as well. Maybe someone will see their pain.
Thank you. Mrs. MLINAR, for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Over the last few days, the social media has been full of sexual harassment in the workplace. Thousands of brave young women have shared their experiences and showed the scale of this problem. But I must say it did surprise me that this fact is being seen by the media and as something new and surprising. Suddenly, everybody starts complaining about codes of behaviour that always existed and has affected women's everyday lives. Social media campaigns alone are not enough. What has to change is the way we deal with power. particularly the power structure itself, the awareness that sexual abuses are exploitation of a power position. Sexual violence is not an expression of strength, and it's an expression of weakness. Sexist and discriminating codes of behavior could never be tolerated. The hashtag #MeToo has to be replaced in future by hashtag #NotMe. Thanks.
La parole au groupe GUE avec Madame BJÖRK.
Thank you very much indeed. Mrs. BJÖRK, on behalf of GUE, 1.5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Me Too has been an eye-opener for many people, and that's a good thing. We know that this is part of our life. It's a constant risk assessment that we are doing. We have to constantly think about it. Me Too is also a question of sisterhood, and I want to give full support for everyone who has been exposed to this kind of harassment. We have to support each other. Then we have to deal with the unbroken silence about what happens in this House. I'd like to support all of those colleagues who are now breaking the silence and who are putting names on the people who harass them. Me Too is also important because it sheds light on a structural problem. It's easy to say, oh, certain cultures and regions. No, it's a transnational power problem in this House, in our society. The Me Too campaign has also brought out that we need men to take their responsibility. If they're part of the problem, they're also part of the solution. They have to stop supporting each other. We have to, men have to speak up when somebody is harassing other people. That is part of the problem with macho culture. This is also a campaign for change. We are legislators, policymakers here in this House. We can create change. We have to start by having a clean house among ourselves. Tomorrow we're going to be voting on measures for dealing with the cases that have occurred here. And we need to show that we are part of the change, that we are part of the solution. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Mrs. REINTKE, on behalf of the Greens, 1 minute.
Madam Chair, me too. Me too. I have been sexually harassed, just like millions of other people in the millions of other women in the European Union. And I think it's about time that we very clearly say that we should not be ashamed, but that the perpetrators should be ashamed. Because sexual harassment is such a widespread problem all over the European Union. And we will need legislative steps in order to combat this problem. And the accession to the Istanbul Convention is a first step, but we will need a directive on the fight against violence against women to really do something about this. And the shocking reports about the events in this Parliament also give us the duty to do something about this. So we will need specific measures to work on the mechanisms and improve the mechanisms for fighting sexual harassment in this House. And one last point. Yes, this is about women, but this is not a women's issue. We need men to speak up. So to all of the men in this chamber and to all of the men in the European Union, you cannot be complacent anymore. Speak up, stand up against sexual harassment. We cannot take this. We need to fight it together. Thank you very much.
La parole est à Madame AIUTO pour 3 minutes.
Thank you very much indeed. Mrs. AIUTO for 3 minutes on behalf of EFD. Thank you, Madam President. Colleagues, in the FEM Committee, on a daily basis, we address issues such as sexual abuse and every other form of violence against women, also at the workplace. This is a sad reality which affects every working environment, and sadly, like any other workplace, the European Parliament is not immune from this type of deplorable conduct. Many of you have expressed indignation at the news in the newspaper. This veil of silence is omerta, which has fallen over the institution to which we belong. Many others have found the courage to stand up and denounce what could be assessed as sexual abuse, which without the inquiry by the journalists would have remained in silence and be forgotten. And reacting at to this type of accusation is a normal reaction, as it's also understandable from the institution to immediately clean up and establish clarities in order to avoid its own honour and authority undermined by shameful acts of individuals. But let's strive not not to be hypocritical and not have a two-speed justice as often happens. This same indignation, this same resoluteness and immediate action, the same zero tolerance and severity vis-à-vis these evils should be applied both within the European Parliament but with the same vigour and on an equal footing in all workplaces, both public and private. Yes, it's good to set a good example, it's good to put our foot down, but let's not forget that this Parliament mirrors what happens outside in the real world, where a subculture based on sexual exploitation permeates across the board. In how many universities, for example, do young students, female students, have to submit to sexual harassment by some unworthy lecturer? In how many offices, public offices too, female workers receive specific attention from their bosses? How many women are offered a job, which is often a mirage these days, bearing in mind the devastating effects of the economic crisis, in exchange for services which can't really be defined as professional? Yes, it makes us furious to remember that for every time someone speaks out and it ends up with a great outcry in the newspapers, there are hundreds of cases that remain under wraps because people are afraid, ashamed or feel guilty. We'll be able to say that we've acted for the best, that we've really stood up for women and also the men who are the victims of this obscene conduct when we react to every form of sexual abuse within the European Union with the same diligence with which we are acting now in order to combat what is happening within our own four walls. Thank you.
La parole au nom du groupe ES.
Now, this is Troszczynski for 1.5 minutes, ENF.
Présidente, l'affaire Weinstein.
Thank you, Madam President. The Weinstein case has allowed the whole world to see the sexual harassment committed by powerful men against women around them. It's empowered them to speak out and demand justice. We must do everything we can to ensure that women who are victims of this kind of violence can obtain justice and compensation. That said, however terrible these acts may be, it cannot justify pillorying people in the public sphere against whom offence has not been proven. Women have to be able to speak out and take their cases to court. The hashtag is a warning of what we should not be doing. It's an invitation to finger pointing. We shouldn't put our faith in the hashtag and assume that every man or boy is a potential perpetrator. Let's face the problem. Let's give young people in the future their innocence back. 1 in 3 young people under the age of 13 in France has already seen a pornographic film. Let's protect them from that violence which makes women objects of sexual pleasure. That ruins our children and makes Weinstein's Hollywood the norm in terms of the picture of male-female relations. And we need to speak out against the sectarian approach of some members of this House who expelled my group from the motion because they claimed it would weaken Parliament's voice. That's an unacceptable attitude in dealing with this subject. It won't stop me voting against, because we need something better than this mean text.
Mrs. James, 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Well, as of media attention this week, we finally know that there is a problem with sexual harassment in this chamber. But the focus seemingly is on sexual harassment of women by male MEPs only. That totally ignores, and I mean ignores, what could be going on, and I'm only suggesting, but I understand it does go on, and therefore sexual harassment should not be gender specific. We got to address this, and Mrs Malmström, the rapporteur, spoke very, very eloquently about what needs to happen. But what is clear is that we don't have a process currently whereby individuals and alleged perpetrators can go to, can resort to, and ask for a suitable investigation. And I do believe that the vote that we're going to have tomorrow morning is bringing this forward too quickly, and we have not addressed sufficiently the scale of what is going on, the nature of what is going on, and I would suggest we go forward with a questor responsibility on this. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Madame Matera, pour 1 minute 30.
Mrs. Matera, for 1 minute 30.
President.
Yes, thank you very much, President. Well, once again, we're talking about a topic that profoundly affects the European Union and its institutions. Following on from the Weinstein case, many women have finally found the courage to report the abuse and harassment that they've suffered. All too often, women around the world are afraid to speak. 13% of women in Europe report having experienced violence in their own lives. Sexual abuse and harassment is contained in the Istanbul Convention. That calls for the criminalization of violence against women. Stalking, harassment, rape, other forms of abuse. But there is no cross-cutting legislation in Europe. There has been insufficient ratification of the Istanbul Convention. All member states have laws that make this behaviour illegal, but there is no homogeneous protection for victims. What I'm asking for in this Parliament and across the entire Union are exemplary punishments and proper legislation. Kofi Annan said that violence and harassment of women is one of the most shameful crimes because it knows no borders of a cultural or national nature. This needs to be dealt with across the entire world because that is what is preventing development, peace and functioning societies. Thank you very much.
Mr. Bullmann, you are the first man to interrupt the list of female speakers, so you have the floor for 1.5 minutes. Thank you, Madam President. Madam Commissioner. Colleagues. Well, we bow to the courage of those affected, because it's not easy to stand up and speak out about what happens. But these courageous people are creating space for a debate which is so urgently needed. We're talking about more than individual false behavior, wrong behavior. We're talking about something, a dimension which, well, we could very easily put an end to if we were simply to, or we can understand what it's about if we look at the statements of the current US President as to how we should treat women. That's what it's all about. This culture of admissibility, accepting this type of behavior. It's always got something to do with dominance, with power, with suppression. There's always something to do with lording it over someone else. Now, we have to uncover what's going on. We have to speak and amongst each other and bring in a culture of dignity, a culture of respect. This applies for the European Parliament and it applies to Europe. And a plea, if I may, this is a very personal question. Let's not today forget what is happening today in the refugee camps on the external borders of Europe, where women, young girls, children are being abused, and what scandals we are accepting in our full awareness. Obviously, we have to involve all of this in today's debate because our refugee policy also involves these issues. Thank you. Mrs. Gerning, 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. The culture in the entertainment world seems to be that those, particularly women, who want to work in the industry are preyed upon by powerful individuals, mostly men, who can make or break their careers. The term casting couch is so well known that it's entered the English language. So this is not a new concept. And I'd like to thank all those brave women who have come out into the Me Too campaign. I'd particularly like to thank the brave employees of this Parliament who have spoken out in recent days. Now, it's really important, I believe, to seize the momentum and do something in our own workplace. And I'd like to see the resolution concentrate on that aspect. I think the structure is in place, and I'd like to thank our quester, Mrs. Bearder, for sending round a note yesterday that showed us that the structure is there, but people still don't feel confident to use that structure. And that's the real problem. We don't take it seriously enough. So if there's fear of losing a job, we can actually individually as MEPs do something, certainly for our APAs. And I'd like to pledge here and now that I, as a member of this Parliament, if there is an assistant out there who feels they're going to lose their job, come and work in my office then temporarily. I will offer them a safe haven. And I'd like other members to join me in that pledge.
Colleagues, I must stress that you have to respect speaking time. We have quite a lengthy list of people who've asked for the floor under the Catch the Eye procedure. I've closed the list now, so please respect your speaking time. And this doesn't necessarily apply to you, Sophie, but you have the floor now for 1 minute. Mrs. in 't Veld.
I believe we are the first parliament in Europe to publicly debate the issue of sexual harassment and intimidation. And unfortunately, it is necessary. We have to talk about how we put into practice what we preach and provide a free and safe work environment for the people who work for us and who work for all the Europeans. Yes, we have a harassment committee, complaints procedures and what have you, but why have only 10 cases been brought forward since 2014? That means that the threshold is too high and just procedures is not enough. In these last days, after the Me Too campaign, I get the question often by men, well, I'm not so sure anymore what I can and what I cannot do, when do I cross the border? And I always say, it's easy. You know, if you have a daughter, just ask yourself, how would I want my daughter to be treated? Well, that's the way you're going to treat other people. It's not just about violence. Also about sexism, sexist remarks. It's not harmless. Sexist jokes are not funny, they're just sexist. And they lead to harassment and violence. And final remark, Madam Chair, to be clear, women and men decide for themselves. Of course, what consenting adults do between each other is not our business, but when the girl says no, it means no.
Madame Forenza, 1 minute.
Mrs. Forenza, 1 minute.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, Madam President. Feminism taught me to, it's not for myself, me too. I was at university, I was 19, he was at 70, he was a teacher. Having moved to another teacher, having said no, you know, something I can't forget. And I can't forget what happened that day, the shame and anger I felt. Above all, I will never forget the women who helped me overcome that disgusting event. Me too. We together. I think it's important today for us as a parliament, with the Commissioner here, to say we'll be together against male violence against women. Women building up each other's strength. We need a global political movement today. We'll be coming out on the streets again on the 25th of November to speak out against macho violence, exploitation and racism. Because many women don't speak out, and macho solidarity and complicity is still too strong. We have to fight against the macho culture and ratify the Istanbul Convention. The speaker's been cut off.
Urtasun, 1 minute.
Mr. Urtasun, 1 minute.
Sí, muchas gracias. En primer lugar,
Thank you very much indeed. First and foremost, I'd like to speak out about and express my repulsion of what's happened and congratulate all those brave women who've spoken out, because it's crucial that this comes to the surface. 55% of women in the EU have claimed to have been victims of sexual crime. 20-odd% say that this has happened by colleagues, friends at work, their bosses. We're talking about a very widespread phenomenon which is totally unacceptable. But I would like to comment on what's happening in this House today. Of all the cases which have come out in the press for the European institutions, how many have been officially reported through the mechanisms we have in this Parliament? Very few, virtually none. We have to find ways for people to speak out about this behaviour. And the second point I wanted to make is that it's our responsibility as well. There are going to be more than 40 speakers in this debate today. Only 5 of them are men. That is not acceptable, and we also have to speak out against this. This is happening around us, and we have to speak out against sexual violence and harassment. Thank you. Mrs. Packer, 1 minute.
Sexual harassment is shockingly all too common in today's society and in this European Parliament. While statistically women are over 5 times as likely as men to experience sexual assault, it is important to note that sexual harassment and abuse affects both men and women. We've all heard the stories and rumours that are going on for many years. The very place that claims to legislate against this sort of disgusting behaviour is turning a blind eye to its practice. The idea that MEPs or staff are using their positions of power to perpetrate abuse is shameful and unacceptable. I want some clarification. Can members of the Bureau tell us all they know about their in-camera meeting at the end of last year regarding 15 MEPs that are accused of sexual harassment? These files should be opened up to public scrutiny. Please action this immediately. Thank you.
Madame Záborská, 1 minute 30.
Many thanks, Madam Commissioner, Madam Chairwoman. The recent expositions in the media and on our social networks clearly point out that sexual abuse is a problem of Europe, its member states and its institutions. As we have been fighting against violence on women, we also need to talk not only about helping victims and punishing the perpetrators, but also about prevention. And I think that the only effective prevention is education from childhood to respect the dignity of every human being. Perpetrators of sexual violence and abuse very often abuse their position of power. Yet the victims which decide to report such behavior, these are threatened with losing job or being transferred to a different job or having a mention in their personal file which will be an obstacle in their future career. As MEPs, we can only appeal to member states to make sure that in their educational programs they will emphasize the need to respect every human's dignity and to help victims better. But we should also do more in order to help victims and to punish the perpetrators of sexual abuse and violence here in this chamber. Knowing that inappropriate behavior will have significant and far-reaching consequences, for example by losing a part of your salary to the benefit of the victim, this could have a preventive effect. At the same time, such compensation will at least somehow compensate the victim. Thank you very much.
Merci. La parole.
Thank you very much. The floor goes to Mrs. Revault d'Allon-Bonnefoy. Thank you very much, President. Thank you, Commissioner. Over the last few weeks, thousands of women have denounced sexual harassment and abuse through the hashtag #MeToo or Get Rid of Your Pig. Well, yes, this is a scourge that has affected women across Europe. 1 out of every 2 women has been a victim. It's much too easy for this simply to be tolerated and hushed up. All of the personal experiences that have been published on social media are a call upon the institutions, and I think that we should respond through the Istanbul Convention. The Convention starts with the following words: violence towards women has to be seen as a violation of human rights. It's serious and it has to be seriously punished. What's no longer tolerable is the impunity of the perpetrators. Article 50 of the Convention states clearly that criminal penalties are required for sexual crimes. In our last report from December, we call upon member states to ensure that the member states and the EU as a whole ratify the Convention and implement it swiftly. Those member states who have no longer done it, well, I'd like to thank Estonia for doing so recently, but please ratify the Istanbul Convention. The ratification by the Union does not dispense them from their own obligations. So we do need a change of mentalities and behaviour so that we can permanently get rid of this scourge. Women and girls need to be protected. Mr. Škripek for 1 minute.
Dear Chairman, colleagues, the money, sex and power. These are the 3 sins that dirty many leaders. It's a poisonous cocktail that attracts many ambitious people, but people who suffer from complexes. We are talking about machismo, about men being bad, but it's a stereotype. There are women who also molested. There are cases in the institutions. Don't speak about male people only. Molestation is happening among homosexuals as well, and we are silent about that. We have to stop the process that makes objects from men and women, and these objects are used in the fantasies. This is pornography. These are relations without obligations. This is the tragical sexual moral relations that we can observe. Whether it's the institution of the EU or it's the Hollywood, we have to ask for the respect for men and for women as people. We have to ask self-discipline from them and a focus on the family, because these concepts can stop the sexual problems.
Gracias. For 1 minute. Thank you, Madam President. Commissioner, sexual harassment continues to exist because there's still fear. Because fear is what keeps the victims quiet and ensures impunity for the perpetrators themselves. Women are afraid that they'll lose their jobs, they won't be believed. Why aren't the perpetrators are afraid? How is it possible to have European legislation, which since 2002 has provided protection and regarded this as a crime, is not enough of a deterrent for the perpetrators? Why are these criminals not afraid? Why aren't we applying legislation stringently? 55% of women in the European Union say they've suffered sexual harassment at least once. It's as much as 75% in the case of women in management. It happens everywhere, including here in the European Parliament. That's unacceptable, and we're not going to put up with it any longer. This is a joint effort. The victims who have made this breach in the wall of silence deserve all our protection, and all of us here need to speak out and say, of course, me too.
Madame KUNEVA.
Mrs. KUNEVA, 1 minute.
Thank you. Luckily, we are no longer hiding. We are talking out against sexual harassment, and that also exists within the European Parliament, which should be one of the most protected working environments in the world, where women are elected and there's a high level of education. Think how much worse it is for a refugee woman in a camp. And just imagine how much worse their situation is than it is here in the European Parliament. We need a clear mechanism to protect the victims of harassment. We need to puncture their fear, otherwise we are not going to be successful. We also need to stand together democratically, and we need to ensure that the complaints are democratically addressed as well. We also need to have an independent commission of experts to understand what's happening here in the European Parliament, so that we're not accused of wrapping things up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Me too. Well, yes, I too have been the victim of sexual harassment and abuse, and I think it's very painful to have to see these people still powerful with absolutely no impact on their position. There's a feeling of solidarity right now, and there's a feeling of happiness that finally we can talk about these painful memories that we all share. We have to break the silence, and that is what we are doing today. I want more men as models, as role models in this fight. It is not just women's responsibility. We need more men standing up in the public sphere and calling out sexual harassment when it takes place. We need people to talk about their own experiences as perpetrators. We need more men to break destructive male norms such as aggressivity, dominance behavior. We need basically more equality across society. That is going to be essential to change our society. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. And the Weinstein case has given confidence to many to come out and to speak and to tell their story of how they have been treated
Sexual harassment should not be tolerated in any form. It's an abuse of a powerful position, and I'd like to pay tribute to all those brave women who have come out and told their story, and they facilitated others in coming forward, and I think it's been a very important step, and I think that we should look at the role the media has played in this, both traditional media and indeed social media, in giving young women in general, and mostly as young women, confidence to come and tell their story. But we need to ask ourselves, how come it isn't that the structures that are in place in this Parliament have not facilitated those women to come forward? They don't have confidence, they don't feel comfortable, and most importantly, they don't feel safe in coming forward to the structures that are in place. And I think that it's a question for all of us. The EU Employment Equality Directive is designed to protect employees from sexual harassment, and that legislation must work for all employees in every workplace across Europe. We need to provide here in the Parliament a safe workplace free from harassment of any kind, and we need to provide the structures and the proper reporting mechanisms so that individuals can come forward, as I say, in a situation where they feel safe. And I think the onus is on all of us to ensure and to ask questions as to why that's not happening to date.
Merci. Madame.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Blinkevičiūtė, 1 minute 30.
Thank you, Madam President. Sexual harassment is a phenomenon which has a very harsh impact. If the victim resists, her career may be ruined. If she resigns herself to her fate, that may lead to psychological trauma, which can become very serious, because where victims do actually complain and the perpetrators find themselves in court are rare exceptions to the rule. We're talking here about an abuse of power with consequences which constitute violations of human rights. Sadly, this problem exists also within the European Parliament, which is why, in my view, we need to have a detailed inquiry, bringing in outside experts. The current mechanism is clearly not effective enough. We need to set up a mechanism which will bring in professional psychologists and legal advisors who can provide counselling and advice to victims. We need to act against those who think they can abuse their power with impunity. We have tools to do that. The European Parliament equipped itself with a code of conduct for its members, with an ethical code applying to the administration. There must be severe penalties in both instances for sexual harassment. Means much reality of this.
Better, 2 minutes.
Harassment are wrong and must be stopped, but sexual harassment is particularly pernicious. This Parliament has a committee that deals with harassment cases when MEPs are involved, and I sit on that committee. We have a constant stream of cases, but coming forward is very distressing for the victims. Disclosure is a professional and financial risk for them, so victims don't come forward and their cases go unreported. And so we don't see the full extent of the case. The situation is not acceptable. We cannot be complacent. We must get better. Better at preventing harassment in the first place by introducing mandatory MEP training. Better at encouraging the victims to come forward by giving guarantees that they will not lose their jobs, and better at acting swiftly once the investigation has been completed, with sanctions imposed against the MEPs. We have a long way to go, as do many large institutions. This Parliament must demonstrate that we are a fair, safe and respectful place for all to come and work at. Thank you.
Merci, Madame Vallina. 1 minute également.
Mrs. Vallina, 1 minute. Thank you very much indeed, Mrs. President. At the start of this session, we decided that this would be included as an urgent debate because of the information in the press. Now, I know that some people were against this, but for most women in this institution, we are aware of that what we're talking about is sometimes a secret. We have to congratulate those brave women who have spoken out, and to all of those participants in the Me Too campaign. But this is not just about making declarations today, voting tomorrow, and then forgetting it. Once again, we're calling on the European Commission to come up with a directive to combat violence against women, and also on all member states to ratify and implement the Istanbul Convention. Most cases are not denounced because people are afraid of social stigmatization, and they're also afraid of losing their job. In this Parliament, there is a committee which follows up denunciations amongst assistants and MEPs, but the majority of these people are made up of members of the Parliament, so people are worried to speak out. We shouldn't forget that the lack of security at work is one major driver for this type of violence. Thank you.
Mrs. Delli, 1 minute. Colleagues, there are 2 men on my staff. Have I ever taken one of them into my office, pushed them against a cupboard? Have I touched their bottoms in a lift? No, I've never done that. But nevertheless, that happens to so many women here in this house, the European Parliament. The political world is made by men for men. How many of you know about behavior like this? How many of you stayed silent? Power has given men a sense of impunity that is no longer tolerable. This needs to cease, not tomorrow, but today. For all the girls and women of Europe, we need to act rapidly. We need to carry out prevention work everywhere, at all times. We need to train the police and the legal systems, because fear and shame have to move to the other camp. Thanks.
1 minute 30.
Sorry, I have 1 minute and 30 seconds. Okay, I will speak in Hungarian. Néhány hete is
A few weeks ago, we discussed the importance of combating violence against women, and recently it became even more public how serious this problem is and how long it has been wiped under the carpet. In the EU, there are more than 250 million women who are exposed to some form of violence, and 1/3 of women has been subject to physical violence in her adult life. It's not only the next generations which we have to educate about violence, not only the mindset of the youth should be changed, but everyone else's. This issue is about mutual respect. If you're able to respect each other as human beings, respect each other's decisions and will, regardless of being women or men. It never ever should a woman feel humiliated because she was born a woman. Half a year ago, we launched a campaign in Transylvania, Romania, to raise awareness about the importance of combating violence against women, rendering legislation more rigorous, and informing women about their rights and options. And we also started training for students. As we've seen, publicity plays an immense role in clearing these issues, and we have to therefore support every member state to collaborate with NGOs and take actual measures to immediately protect women who are victimized, institutional help, free legal aid, information and financial support.
Parole est à Madame Picierno pour 1 minute 30 également.
Mrs. Piciano, 1.5 minutes. Thank you, President. Well, I would like to thank all those women who, through speaking out, have triggered a debate which has once again brought to light all of the difficulties, the imbalance in a debate which still sees women as victims twice over. Firstly, when they're abused, and secondly, when people judge them for the way they dress, the way they behave, for their sacrosanct ambitions. These women, colleagues, these women, well, it's us, all of us, who, wherever Whatever our background, our class, our race, our religion, we are open to physical or verbal violence, explicit or undercover, but there is still an unacceptable limit there to our freedom of expression, our careers and our very lives when it comes down to it. It is our duty to go beyond sheer indignation. It's up to us to create a new mindset which, colleagues, involves men first and foremost. Men have to stop thinking that the problem of violence against women is a women's problem. On the contrary, no, it's a problem which is basically that of men. Let's call a spade a spade. It's everyone's problem. It's a problem also of this Parliament, which has to send out a very clear message. Say we are here, and say very clearly with one single voice, me too.
Une minute.
Ms. VAUTMANS, 1 minute. Thank you, Madam President, Commissioner, colleagues. The #MeToo hashtag has brought in a great range of shocking stories from a wide range of sectors, sadly also including this House. Masturbation in offices, with women being housed in the lift. These are things which should not exist in the 21st century, in 2017. And what about the power relationship? If it's your boss who's doing it, you need the job, you've got to feed your kids and pay off your mortgage. I hope that the #MeToo hashtag has broken a taboo and will now stiffen women's resistance. They'll stand up and say, no, we're not going to put up with this. And secondly, men have to realise when they're going too far and say, not me, I'm not going to do this. And then lastly, Madam President, I always hoped that the European Parliament protected its workers. Sadly, that doesn't appear to be the case here. Whence the call to action, the victims in this House have to be protected. The President, please remain standing if you accept Mr. Coburn's blue card question.
Mr. Coburn,
you have the floor.
Elle n'a pas encore dit oui, Monsieur Coburn.
Madam VAUTMANS, sexual harassment should never be tolerated, I'm sure you agree with me, whether in the streets of Cologne or in the corridors of power in Brussels. It's absolutely intolerable, and that's regardless of sexual orientation. However, some liberals here are in favour of stereotyping. And Madam VAUTMANS, didn't you say something that was reported, I believe, in Politico, that sexual harassment is commonplace in southern and eastern Europe? I mean, isn't that stereotyping people? I don't think that's quite right. If a right-wing Eurosceptic had said such a thing, everybody would go crazy here. So would you take that back?
Madame VAUTMANS, je suis sûre que vous avez une réponse.
Ms. VAUTMANS, I'm sure you have a reply.
I don't think I told it here, but I told it to a journalist who wrote it very hard and harder than I said it. I only said that here in the Parliament you have a mix of cultures, and some cultures are more open and warm and more open to touch to people, and other cultures have different opinions on that. So I never wanted to stigmatize any culture. It happens in every culture, it happens in every sector, and it happens in every place. The only thing I wanted to say is maybe some cultures have to think a little bit.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, Ms. VAUTMANS. Please wind up.
Merci, Madame. Monsieur Polčák pour 1 minute 30.
Mr. Polčák, 1.5 minutes.
Děkuji, paní předsedkyně, za udělení slova, vážená paní komisařko.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Now, in many cases, women have had to experience sexual violence from their partners as well, and I wanted to express my solidarity with those women in particular. Half of all women in Europe have been the victims of verbal harassment or attacks on the internet, and I'm really shocked that pretty much a quarter of Europeans thinks that it's possible to have sex with someone without their agreement. a lot of people think that women are inventing harassment accusations. In many cases, women are too afraid to report the violence. Members of their family are aware of the situation and don't intervene either. There's also the problem of harassment within the institutions. Commissioner Jourova recently joined the Me Too campaign, and I think we really need to change our social approach. We cannot allow people to think that this behaviour is normal. We should not victimise the woman and suggest that it's their fault. It's a problem within the institutions. The Union thus needs to ratify the Istanbul Convention. I think that is our obligation. We must intervene.
Pour le catch the eye, je suis obligée de vous demander de respecter.
I'm sorry, we've had a lot of requests to speak under Catch the Eye. So, Ms. Hitt, 1 minute.
In our work in the European Parliament, it's very important for us to tackle all forms of discrimination, harassment and other crimes and take them seriously. We need to combat all of these forms of violence. We have the possibility to act in legislative terms to forbid discrimination, but we also have a role in influencing public opinion. As MEPs, it's up to us to say, it's time to stop this. It's not enough to simply legislate away these forms of behaviour. We need to use other channels too to try and change standards, norms, power structures that result in women being victims of this kind of oppression. We need to be very careful in pointing one thing out. Those who are victims of harassment are important, but we have to look at the situation within this House. Anyone who works for an MEP or within the European Parliament has to feel that they can report their activities without risking being sacked. Thank you.
Pour 1 minute.
Mr. Martin, 1 minute.
Oui, merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam President. Well, in this European Parliament, there is no more harassment than anywhere else, but there's not less either. And through this very transparent debate, I was preparing to say that we were taking account of our responsibilities, but that apparently that doesn't apply to everyone else. And Mr. ŠKRIPEK, how many times have you been sexually harassed? Let's not forget that we're in the limelight here and that what we decide here will have repercussions for the rest of our society. Quite obviously, we are not guilty for what's happening, but we have collective responsibility to put an end to it. And if we don't do that, then yes, we will be guilty. So I have 3 proposals. It's already been said, we have to put an end to these precarious work situations of our assistants, giving them a genuine possibility to speak out. 95% of women are fired when they speak out. Secondly, an external audit has to assess the extent of this phenomenon and the effectiveness of measures adopted in order to get rid of this culture from our institution, not to speak out against individual cases. And finally, we need a special committee on sexual harassment to be set up. Thank you.
Borzan, 1 minute.
Thank you, Ms. President. This is a great test for the Parliament to show that the recommendations that we send, we can apply ourselves. This is a very important moment when we are sending a message to the victims of abuse in the European Parliament, in the entire European Union. The EPP proposes doesn't deem acceptable that we establish a body within the European Parliament, because it shows that we want to hide something. So I think that I can support the S&D in order to have an external body. We cannot send just a report and show that we have resolved something. Some say that the Istanbul Convention is damaging for women and families, but it is violence that is damaging for them. So we have to have a very strong framework to empower victims and also to have strict sanctions to show that the Parliament has zero tolerance.
Morin-Chartier pour 2 minutes.
Mrs. Morin-Chartier for 2 minutes. Thank you very much indeed, President. This institution has a duty of care. In legal terms, that's what it's known as. It has a duty of care with regard to every worker in this institution. Sexual harassment, therefore, is a problem that concerns us and that we must tackle. We must allow women to free themselves of this shroud of guilt and secrecy. And yes, I currently chair the harassment committee. Yes, I am a member of the EPP. And yes, I am committed to this work. And I think we need to focus on 3 key objectives. First of all, witnesses need to be able to come forward. They need to be able to come forward towards a trusted person, a person who will be able to hear these victims, help them to speak out. This is key. Things are not being said. People are too afraid, too scared to speak out, and that needs to change. We need this to happen, first of all. Secondly, we need a mediator, someone who can act as an intermediary between the institution as a whole and the victims. Now, I am not in favor of there being 2 separate harassment committees. Let me tell you why. Because psychological harassment, sexual harassment, where do you draw the line? Because one can easily turn into the other. So this needs to be kept together, and we should not multiply structures. This is not what we need to do. We need the structures and support mechanisms that exist to work and function properly. Madam President, I think everyone needs to be informed about what kinds of risks members are taking, and that they are fully aware of what is and is not acceptable in this House.
Voilà.
Thank you. I'd like to now give the floor under the Catch the Eye procedure. We have 15 requests, and I will take all requests, and I will accommodate all those requests. I request, therefore, that everyone sticks to the speaking time to allow everyone a chance to speak. Mrs. Šulin is first.
Hvala predsedujoča za besedo, spoštovani. Ostro obsojam kakršnokoli spolno nadlegovanje.
When it comes to sexual harassment, we need to adopt a zero-tolerance policy. Sexual harassment is not something we can ignore. It doesn't disappear simply by being ignored. Victims need to be able to speak out, and they need to be given proper protection. There is a lot of fear surrounding this, a lot of stigma. This is why sexual harassment needs to be identified early, and action needs to be taken swiftly. I'm very pleased that we are having this discussion in the plenary. We cannot be silent on this issue, and we have to guarantee people's dignity and rights. Mrs. Chinnici.
Grazie Presidente.
Thank you, President. Sexual abuse and mistreatment, either in the family or at the place of work, and now on the internet with things such as revenge porn making their appearance, is a real blow to human rights. Sexual violence starts very, very young for the victims and causes trauma which lasts a long, long time. Psychological pressure, the fear of intimidation, and that makes it so difficult for the victims to speak out and to come forward. I think that the European institutions, the European Parliament, has to be more vigorous in combating this scourge. Of course, we need to follow developments so that the Member States fully respect the directive on the victims of crime, and in particular the Istanbul Convention as well. Mrs. Bilbao Barandica.
Thank you, President, Commissioner. I think this public outcry against sexual harassment is a good thing. The institutional support needs to be made up of a fight against abuse occurring in the first place and also putting an end to impunity. There needs to be a joint commitment from men and women in the institution. There needs to be an end to sexist and macho jokes. There needs to be an end to stereotypes in the media. Without all of this, it will just go on and on. We need a daily commitment. This is all about power and domination. And whilst there continue to be men who giggle and simply shrug away these types of events and think that it is somehow macho and a badge of honor, then all of these stereotypes will continue to go on and we will end up on the losing side.
Gracias, Presidenta.
Thank you, Madam President. The campaign against the scandalous harassment in Hollywood has mobilized thousands, countless women, and it's really shown very clearly that harassment and abuse is everywhere. It affects everyone of every age, every social class. These are daily events. They exist everywhere in public transport, public areas, at the workplace, and between people with differences of relations of power. Now, this phenomenon exists everywhere, but that shouldn't make it normal. It needs to be rooted out and punished. And when we read the newspapers, we see that this campaign exists here, this behaviour exists in the Parliament as well. We need to campaign against it. We need to carry out a detailed investigation. Let's carry out an audit and let's point out the names and put an end to this in the House. These people, perpetrators, are dangerous and they cannot be left unpunished.
Mr. Epitidios. Thank you very much, Madam President. Sexual harassment at the place of work is a habit which has got to be a thing of the past. It's something which affects the European Parliament as well. Members of the European Parliament have got a privileged position and they employ people, they employ assistants. Anyone who exploits their position in order to pressurise or exploit their assistants is a coward. And if we are going to take the measure of this problem, then we must crack down on this scourge in both directions. It's something which affects both men and women. And we talk about combating violence against women. We see violence in many places. If one goes to football matches, for example, you'll see a vast majority of men, and there's violence there as well. Thank you very much.
Mrs. Betsia.
Madam Chair, I'm shocked by media allegations of cases of sexual harassment of assistants by individual MEPs. I support a thorough investigation in order to shed light on such cases and to punish the perpetrators. Unfortunately, none of the global institutions employing a large number of people is spared of cases of abuse or misconduct. The same applies to the EU institutions. However, it is important to adequately tackle such offences in order to prevent them from occurring again. It is good that campaigns such as #MeToo facilitate the establishment of a safe platform for victims to share their experiences, something they would otherwise not dare. Any abuse has a corrosive effect on the whole society. Therefore, it is an obligation for all of us to react to all forms of abuse and harassment. Only through openness, support and courage will it be possible to implement the changes necessary to eradicate any form of misconduct. Thank you.
Like many, I was shocked by the Harvey Weinstein scandal. I was shocked by the violence of the stories told by the victims, but I was not surprised. Some people have said they were surprised by the number of victims who subsequently spoke out online using the MeToo hashtag, but I was not surprised. Most women and girls have been victims of sexual harassment or assault at some point in their lives. The fact that this recent crop of appalling revelations comes from within my own sector, the creative industries, is doubly distressing. The myth of the casting couch was never a myth, but rather an institutional practice which has its parallels in the boardrooms and staff rooms of all workplaces, including both the public and private sector and in the community and voluntary sector too. Trade unions have a particularly important role to play in establishing systems and support for reporting and dealing with abuse. But the education of boys and men should play an important role in the fight against sexual harassment and abuse. Instead of telling girls how to dress or behave, we should educate boys about consent.
Madame McGuinness.
Thank you, Madam President. Well, yesterday the sentencing of a journalist who was regarded as eminent and highly respected for child sex abuse offences has been criticised for the leniency of the conviction and sentence. He received 2.5 years, and the Chief Executive of the Dublin Rape Crisis Centre has led complaints about this. And I suppose what that shows is that even when the law takes its course, society and families are not always satisfied by the outcome. And that is something we need to be conscious of. I visited a women's refuge recently in my constituency, and sexual violence is all too prevalent. But I'm glad to say that there is help and support available, and people should reach out for that support. And I would ask colleagues in this House, staff and members, to put their faith in Elisabeth Morin-Chartier, our colleague, who takes on her shoulders an enormous responsibility and does it with great effect. So please, if you haven't approached her, do. She will listen, she will act.
Monsieur Khan.
Thank you, Madam President. A recent EU survey on harassment and abuse gave some shocking findings, not least that 55% of women have experienced sexual harassment. It must be called out for what it is, a brutal form of discrimination, a basic assault on human dignity, and both a cause and a consequence of persistent inequalities between men and women. I welcome this debate today, but it must form part of a long-term, serious effort to tackle this scourge, because there is a long road ahead. Sexual harassment knows no class or culture and is not confined to the home or the workplace. As such, it is the job of every employer, family member, colleague and friend to stand up for all people that are affected. And for our part, here in this chamber, we must ensure that the information, the support and the zero-tolerance approach to dealing with this is in place. Be it in Hollywood or in our own communities across the European Union and UK, my constituency, sexual harassment is a cancer that must be stopped.
Madame Vosenberg.
Πολύ, κυρία Πρόεδρε. Κυρία Επίτροπε, κύριοι συνάδελφοι, θεωρώ ότι το σημερινό θέμα...
Thank you very much, Madam President. The matter before the House today is very important, not just because it's in the spotlight of public concern, and this is an opportunity for victims to come forward and to have their rights respected, but also because this is something which exists. As long as the mindset, as long as these attitudes and these habits continue, because for 15 years now we've had legislation. The legislation is there, it's on the statute book, and I think that when there is a complaint, we have got to make sure that the details are all there, to make sure that the claims and the complaints are substantiated, and I believe that the Commission has a role to play there, Parliament too. We must not allow our reputation to be sullied in this way. Thank you.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Equal rights, equality between men and women, non-discrimination are European Union values. As a man, I have to express my disgust at harassment. Male dignity is derived from the dignity which men bestow upon women. I think it is particularly disgraceful that there are things happening in this very House. We should have zero tolerance of any form of discrimination and harassment. Education is, of course, important, but in some cases, education is not enough, and then it is essential to have an independent form of justice. That is the way to deal with this sad phenomenon.
Grazie, Presidente. Nelle ultime settimane...
Thank you, Madam President. In the recent weeks, scandal upon scandal has been outed in the media, and the attention is turned to violence against women. As I've said on previous occasions, but it bears repeating, in the light of recent absurd news affecting this Parliament, any violence in any of its forms against women must be sanctioned and punished, whether that's here in the Parliament or anywhere else. Some 25% of women across Europe have suffered physical or sexual violence, and that, if we're talking there about 1 in 4, talking about non-consensual sexual relations. And I think the time has now come, the time has matured to really make inroads with determination into violence against women by using the rules that we have and making sure that the Istanbul Convention stipulations are transposed and put into effect in legislation in all the member states. Thank you.
Arrivé. Prenez la parole pour 1 minute.
Stomasic, 1 minute.
Thank you very much. Sexual harassment and abuse cannot be justified in any way. When EU institutions are involved in sexual abuse in the workplace, it is said that it takes a large public scandal for the problem to be addressed. It is not a secret that this has also been happening for years in this building, and that the victims were discouraged to report it because a climate was created where such abominable behavior was more or less acceptable, but it is not, and it must be punished. All those who report harassment or abuse must be well protected by guaranteeing them that they will not lose their job and that they will be provided with expert assistance. If we want a Europe where people in adverse socio-economic conditions will not be treated as goods, and the European Parliament must lead by example, and responsible behavior must start here and now. Thank you very much.
Monsieur Volken.
Sehr geehrte Frau Präsidentin.
Madam President, thank you for this opportunity to take the floor here today. Mrs. Reintke said earlier today that the problem of sexual harassment is not a women's issue exclusively, and it should not be allowed to be that. And she is right when she pointed out that we've heard mainly from female colleagues here today in this debate, and that is part of the problem. More often than not, men are the perpetrators, and this is why men need to speak out and say, not in my name, and I would call on more male colleagues to come out and take a stand. And I think we have to really ask ourselves what is going on and what's going wrong right now. There is a body in place that allows women to speak out against power, but the way it's constructed surely isn't right, and there's so much courage that's required for victims to come forward in this way. We need to think hard about this.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam President, Commissioner, colleagues. This is an extremely useful debate. There has been solidarity coming from male participants, but it is vital for us to work with non-governmental organizations in our countries, in our member states. Women who report violence need protection. We need education projects. We need infrastructure. There is sexual abuse taking place even in families, so we cannot rely on families alone. People need legal help. They need legal help in order to assert their rights. That means it's not enough to debate the subject here. We need a partnership at national level. This is just the beginning. We have to continue.
Nous avons conclu le catch the eye. Je vous redonne.
To conclude, we've concluded the catch the eye. Commissioner, you have the floor to close.
Madam President, honourable ladies and gentlemen, I think every woman in this House and quite a lot of men have a story to tell on this, either a personal experience or someone that is close to us. Stories about sexual harassment, sexist comments and possibly even violence and rape. And this is not new. It didn't start with the Me Too movement. It has been going on for decades, for centuries. But the novelty this time is that there's a global movement, women crying out, this is not acceptable. Many men as well. This is not something we will continue to accept. We do not accept that this is hidden, the shame, the silence around this phenomena. And that is so powerful, and that is why I thank you for this debate. There are a lot of laws in the European Union. There are projects. There are directives, there are code of conducts. These are important. The arsenal of legal and policy measures at the EU level covers most of the actions to support member states in their work in fighting all kinds of violence against women and girls. Now we need to focus on implementation, and here there's work to do. We also need to dedicate all the efforts to complete the accession of the Istanbul Convention. We also need to look at ourselves. What are we doing? The Commission has a helpline. We have strong rules to protect whistleblowers who come and alert us on this. We have a network of confidential counsellors who can support women and girls and men who are victims of this. We have internal campaigns and courses and, of course, formal action. And we will subject all this to external evaluation. Possibly we can do more. I'm sure the European Parliament, you have your own rules, you are looking at them. Possibly you can do more on a formal basis. But the most important thing, as this campaign signals, is to support the victims, to say this is not okay what you have experienced. We will go with you. The majority of the men in this House and elsewhere who would never dream of harassing a woman, you need to speak out. You need to support this woman and say this is not okay what my colleague did, and I will walk with you. I will support you in making sure that justice is brought on this. So let's support each other. Let's encourage the network to function in this regard. Let's make sure that not only this Me Too campaign is heard all across the world, but it is transformed to action where hopefully this will lead to eventually an eradication of this violence. The problem is much broader, as we have discussed. We will do what we can from the Commission side. Member States have the role to do, but the most important is a change of attitudes, and here we can all contribute. Thank you very much for having this debate. I think it's of extreme importance, but let not the work stop after the vote tomorrow. Thank you so much.
Merci, Madame la Commissaire. Merci.
Thank you very much indeed, Commissioner. Thank you, colleagues, for the excellent debate we have just had. I've received 7 motions for resolution. The debate is closed and the vote will take place tomorrow. Today's votes take place after a brief adjournment.
Il Presidente.
Bene. Buongiorno a tutti, invito.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Can I invite everyone to please take your seats?
Diamo subito la parola a Panzeri? Sì. Sì. Dov'è Panzeri? Ecco. Allora, iniziamo. Onorevole Panzeri.
Let's make a start. Mr. Panzeri, you want to rise? Thank you very much, President. Just a very few seconds to inform the House that on the 17th of December 2015, we here adopted a resolution on the case of Ibrahim Lawa, an Irish citizen imprisoned in Egypt. Yesterday, after 4 years of detention, he was able to go back free to Ireland. And news of this kind is few and far between. It's rare. And it's worthwhile highlighting because this is a real signal of hope to so many people, activists, human rights defenders, journalists, lawyers who have been unjustly imprisoned and incarcerated. So we welcome the decision by the Egyptian Court of Justice, whereby all the charges against Ibrahim have now fallen, have been thrown out. And this is a message of hope to people behind bars in Egypt and elsewhere. And Commission, we must demand from the Egyptian government that they proceed with the release of all those behind bars simply for having exercised their rights of freedom to thought, association and expression. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Panzeri. Mr. Korwin-Mikke, please.
Thank you. Yesterday we have 1 minute silence in honor of Mrs. Daphne Caruana Galizia, and after that I proposed that we offer 1 million prize for murderers of Ms. Daphne Caruana Galizia, dead or alive. And I was told by Mr. Rainer Wieland that it is impossible because there is no provision in the budget we can offer the prize for the murderers. I want to have the budget in which we can offer the prize for the murderers. Thank you very much.
Grazie, andiamo avanti. Onorevole Forenza.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Forenza wants to speak. Yes, President, very quickly to inform the House that on the 6th and 7th of December this year there will be the hearing of the ACDP President, and the institutions must be very vigilant with regard to the case. President Öcalan, his health, there is no news about that, and I think that we must continue to be vigilant with regard to the rights of the Kurdish people. Thank you very much. From the S&D group, GUE ENF, I've received requests for changes to the committees and delegations, and the nominations will be appended to the minutes of this sitting. If there are no queries between now and the adoption of the minutes, those nominations will be deemed to be approved. And now, colleagues, let's move on to the votes. And the first item in the voting session is the budget. And I call the rapporteur, Mr. Mureșan.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I have to inform you about 2 technical corrections.